I never thought that something as trivial as a breakdown could change my life. It was just another night on the road, and driving along Scotland's isolated motorways has never been a problem for me. I've always liked silence, the sound of the engine accompanying my thoughts, but that night the silence seemed wrong. It all started when the lorry began to fail. The engine choked once, twice, until it stopped for good. It was just me, the broken-down lorry and the biting wind. It was as if the whole road had stopped with me, holding my breath. I can't explain it, but I felt I wasn't alone. As I waited for the replacement vehicle, I stared into the darkness around me. I swear, for a moment, I thought I heard something. It wasn't the wind, it was something low, almost like a whisper. I don't know why, but I felt my heart racing. The lorry's radio was off, but it seemed to emit little crackles. I ignored it. It was probably just my head, too tired to think straight. When the replacement vehicle arrived, the driver hardly looked at me. He just handed me the keys and drove off, as if he wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible. That bothered me, but I climbed into the new lorry without giving it much thought. Everything seemed in order except for the radio. It was old, something you'd expect to see in a museum, not an operational lorry. I tried to fiddle with it, but it didn't respond. I thought, never mind. But while I was driving, the radio switched itself on. First came the static, that annoying, constant sound, but then a voice came on. It was an argument, two people. It seemed so real, so intense, that it was impossible to ignore. And that's when the feeling came back, that certainty that I wasn't alone. The voice on the radio was so clear that for a moment I thought I was listening to a local broadcast. Two people were arguing, a man and a woman. Her voice was full of desperation, as if she were begging for something, while he spoke with a cold, cutting tone. The exact words are hard to remember, but what stuck with me was the feeling of fear. I slowed the lorry down without realizing it, as I tried to understand what was going on. There were no radio stations in the area, and I was sure that the device hadn't even been working minutes before. I gripped the steering wheel tighter and tried to convince myself that it was just interference, maybe an amateur radio or something. But what I heard next made my blood run cold. "I know what you did. You'll never get away with it," said the female voice. The next instant, a muffled scream cut through the static, followed by the sound of something breaking, like glass shattering. I switched off the radio immediately, but the static continued. It was as if the button had no effect at all. My heart was pounding so hard that it seemed to echo in my chest. I took a deep breath, trying not to panic. "This isn't real, Sophie, just your imagination." I accelerated the lorry, wanting to leave that road behind as quickly as possible. But as I got further along, the radio got louder. It was no longer human voices. It was something different. Indistinct sounds, moans, and a kind of wailing that seemed to come from somewhere very far away. I tried to look around, searching for something to justify it. It was then that I noticed the shadows on the trees along the road. They seemed to be moving, as if they were following me. The road ahead became narrower and narrower, and a strange mist began to form. It was at that moment that I felt a chill, a strange cold running down my spine. It wasn't just the wind coming through the open window. It was a presence. I knew it. I was no longer alone in that lorry. When I looked at the radio again, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. A dark stain, like rust or blood. That stain on the radio paralyzed me for a few seconds. It wasn't possible. It was just an old radio, rusted by time. None of this is real, I thought, trying to convince myself. But the more I drove, the more everything seemed wrong. The road seemed endless. I knew the route to Edinburgh by heart, but that stretch seemed to stretch on, as if I was stuck in an endless loop. And the radio, well, it had a mind of its own. The voices started to come back, but this time they were different. First, I heard the sound of running footsteps, fast, like someone running away. Then heavy, almost suffocating breathing filled the air. And then, once again, a woman's voice came out, now weak, crying. "Please let me go. Don't tell anyone. I'll do whatever you want." My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, but I kept my eyes fixed on the road. There was no one there. It was just the radio, just interference, just... A shrill scream interrupted my thoughts, so loud that I had to cover my ears. The lorry rocked as if I'd hit something. I instinctively slammed on the brakes, the sound of the skidding tires mixing with the scream from the radio. When I finally stopped, silence took over. Only my uncontrolled breathing filled the void. I looked at the road behind me in the rearview mirror, and my heart almost stopped. There was someone there. The silhouette of a woman was standing in the middle of the road, motionless, illuminated only by the rear lights. I knew it was impossible. I hadn't seen anyone before, but there she was, with her head tilted in a strange way, as if she didn't have the strength to hold it. Before I could do anything, she started walking slowly towards me. The radio, which had been muted, came back to life with a growing hum, as if something was trying to get out of it. And then she stopped, in a low, slurred voice, as if from inside the lorry itself, she said, "You heard it too, didn't you?" My body froze. Those words seemed to echo in my mind, repeating themselves in a tone that was both a whisper and a shout. "You heard it too, didn't you?" I couldn't answer, nor could I move a muscle. The figure continued to stand still on the road, unmoving, but I felt as if it was getting closer and closer, invading my space. I tried to start the lorry again, but the engine just choked, refusing to run. The radio was now emitting a mixture of static and whispers. A few words escaped, indistinct but full of anguish. It seemed that different voices were overlapping, all trapped in a cacophony of suffering. I looked again through the rearview mirror, but the woman was no longer there. My heart leapt in my chest, and my gaze instinctively traveled around the cab of the lorry. Everything was quiet, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. It was as if something invisible was there, breathing along with me, waiting for me to make a mistake. That's when I saw my reflection. In the front window, amidst the darkness, her silhouette appeared again, now much closer. Her eyes weren't normal. They were pools of shadow, empty but full of something I can't describe. She raised her hand, as if to touch the glass, but her expression was one of pure desperation. "Help me," she said, but the voice came from the radio, not from her. I knew I had to get out of there, but something inside me stopped me. It was as if that road, that lorry, everything was pulling me towards a place where there was no escape. Taking a deep breath, I decided I had to face it. I got out of the lorry, the key still in the ignition, and started walking towards the road. The air was thick, heavy, and the silence was so absolute that my footsteps sounded deafening. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice shaky but firm enough to cut through the darkness. There was no immediate response, just the icy wind against my face and the distant sound of something that sounded like a muffled cry. Then she appeared again, now by my side. I don't know how to describe what I felt. It wasn't fear. It was as if I was looking at something deeply wrong, something that shouldn't exist. "They never let me go," she said, and her voice sounded like several people talking at once, each carrying a story of pain. Suddenly, everything became clear. The voices on the radio, the whispers, the screams, they were fragments of what had happened on that road. A road marked by tragedies, forgotten crimes, interrupted lives. But there was more. Something in the way she looked at me, as if she was seeing me and not just looking at me, made my heart squeeze. She knew something about me, something I didn't want to face myself. "You heard?" because you carry your own secrets." Those words were like a blow. My instinct was to deny it, to shout that she was wrong, but deep down, I knew I couldn't. I was carrying my guilt, my wrong choices, and maybe that's what connected me to that road, to that moment. I carried my guilt, my wrong choices, and maybe that's what connected me to that road, to that moment. "What now?" I asked, my voice barely coming out. She came closer, almost touching my hand. The radio squawked in the lorry again, the voices growing in intensity, shouting words I couldn't understand. "Now you choose, move on, or stay." I knew what she meant. If I stayed, I would be consumed by the memories, the pain that she and so many others carried. But moving on meant facing my own ghosts, facing what I had been avoiding for years. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and made my decision. I chose. With my heart racing and my hands shaking, I got back into the lorry. I didn't look back, even though I felt his presence just a few steps away. The radio still emitted the distressing sounds, but now they seemed distant, as if they were being sucked away somewhere. I took a deep breath and turned the key in the ignition. This time, the engine roared to life, as if it understood the urgency of the moment. "You've decided to follow," her voice sounded, but no longer like a shout or a wail. It was almost serene, resigned. As I accelerated and the road began to take shape again, I realized that the mist had disappeared. The shadows of the trees, once so threatening, now seemed normal. But the radio was still on, broadcasting a single phrase on repeat. "Don't look back." Every word was a blow, because the urge to look was almost uncontrollable. Something inside me wanted to see if she was still there, if those voices were still following me. But I knew that if I looked, there would be no turning back. I drove the truck for a few more kilometers until the road finally seemed familiar again. The radio went silent, and calm began to settle in. Everything seemed to be back to normal. Almost. When I stopped at a petrol station, I got out to check the truck. That's when I noticed something on the passenger seat. An old, stained piece of fabric, carefully folded. I had no idea how it had got there, but when I touched it, I felt the same cold I had felt that night. I didn't take it with me. I left the cloth on the seat and carried on traveling, not daring to think too much about what it meant. But one thing was clear. Something about that road, that woman, had touched me in a way that couldn't be undone. Deep down, I knew that there was something inside me that I hadn't yet faced. That journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. But to this day, when I hear static on the radio or feel a cold wind for no reason, I remember. And even without meaning to, I think of the phrase I've heard so many times, "You never left." 2 days later, while unloading the cargo in Edinburgh, I tried to forget what had happened. I convinced myself that it was just exhaustion, perhaps even a hallucination caused by stress. But the feeling that something was different persisted, like a shadow that followed me around. It was at the end of the shift, as I walked back to the lorry, that I noticed something strange. The vehicle seemed untouched, but when I opened the door, a familiar smell took over. Iron, old, and oxidized. It was the same smell I had smelt on the road. On the passenger seat, where I'd left the piece of fabric, there was now something that had no explanation. A portable radio, as old as the one on the lorry's dashboard. It hadn't been there before, I was sure. I picked it up carefully, but it was dead. No batteries, no sign of working. Still, I felt a chill when I held it, as if I were holding something I shouldn't have. I decided to leave it there. I locked the lorry door and drove away, telling myself that there was no reason to worry anymore. But that night, back in my little flat, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. That empty look, full of secrets that I never wanted to understand. The next day, while I was having breakfast, I received a call from a fellow lorry driver. He asked if I had heard about an accident that had happened on the same road where my breakdown had occurred. A lorry had overturned and the driver had been found dead. The most disturbing detail? The lorry's radio was on, repeating the same words I'd heard. "You never left." I've avoided that road ever since. Some colleagues say it's superstition, but I know what I've experienced. Sometimes while I'm driving, I see figures in the rear-view mirror or hear a low static on the radio, but I ignore it. I just hope I never hear that phrase again. What about you? If you ever pass that road, will you be ready to face what you might find? Will you listen to the voices or just keep going? The choice will be yours.